Sorry, I haven't put the one up from last time. That'll get done tonight, as well as this one. So anyway, so tonight, go away there. Okay, what we're gonna do is we're gonna pivot kind of a little bit. So up until now, we've basically just been doing a bunch of like supply and demand, right? And that's been hopefully mildly interesting. It has some cool applications and some cool stuff that you can apply to any business decision at all. But what we're going to do is we're going to pivot into sort of like the managerial side of things. And specifically, we're going to look at strategic decision making. Okay. And so I want to just kind of start, at the broad level, right? And then we'll kind of get into some specifics of how to do this kind of stuff. So whether you guys want to admit it or not, we're all just constantly engaged in what we could call strategic behavior. And strategic behavior in economics, at least, what it means is two or more people interacting somehow. Right. So like driving a car is a strategic decision, together. Right. So driving a car, right, that's a strategic decision because you want to make sure that you are on, in the US case, you want to be on the right-hand side of the road, right, instead of driving on the left when everyone else is driving on the right. That sounds bad, right? That's how car accidents happen, that kind of stuff. You also want to make sure that you get over to the right lane, if you have to get off the road or whatever. But you can also think of strategic behavior in more aggressive settings like major contract negotiations between you and some other firm. Okay, so all of that is captured under the headline of strategic behavior. And so what I want to do tonight is start developing like a framework that you can use to analyze any strategic or any type of interaction with anyone else in any setting. And I'm going to give you some examples from my own life because I use this stuff every day. The numbers are going to make some sense if you think about when I created these examples, which was 5 years ago. So 5 years ago, I was not married and did not have a kid, so numbers have changed. But the underlying logic still makes some sense. Okay. We also want to understand this stuff. So why does it matter? We want to understand it so that we can perhaps avoid conflict. Okay, so if we can understand when conflicts are going to arise, we can start preparing for them. And we can also use these insights to perhaps prevent bad or less desirable outcomes. But in order to do that, we have to understand where the bad outcomes come from and why they happen, even in situations where we're faced with like really nice, really kind, and really loving people. Okay, so let's just kind of start with, so there's going to be a bunch of sports examples at the beginning, so I apologize. But like in basketball, there is this concept called like hot hands. Right, if you played NBA Jam when you were younger, right, he's on fire, all that good stuff. Okay, so the idea behind hot hands is like someone on the team is just shooting like really accurate. They're just really good, like they're playing really, really well. Okay, and so what some people will say is like, oh, so and so has hot hands. We want to give them the ball, right? And sometimes that's true, but there's something kind of weird. Because if we look at empirically, when a basketball player is playing sort of above average, what the defense will do, right, is they'll respond, right? So they might start guarding other people. So here, right, the defense might respond, and change what they're doing, okay? And then in turn, the offense might change their strategies. Right, so if you watch any sports at all that have like two teams playing against each other, there is sort of like a strategic interaction going on there as well. Right, the same kind of thing. We could do it in football. right? If you're more familiar with that sport, right? If you've ever heard the phrase, the run, sets up the pass, right? That phrase is basically saying like, hey, if you can establish a running game, the defense is going to have to shift where their players are to be closer to the start of the play or the line of scrimmage, right? But that means there are fewer players, back behind them, and so you can throw the ball over the defenders, and things can change. Okay, so what we're looking for here is any situation where we can understand a little bit better how two different teams or two different people or two different groups are interacting, in a predictable and understandable way. We also see this in the business world. Okay, so like big / major firms, companies, right? So let's think about like Apple, for example. Okay, so if you guys have if you've looked, what companies tend to produce sort of like the groundbreaking or like industry changing products? Is it usually like a big major company in that industry, or is it kind of like a small startup that shakes things up? Like which one seems more common?
The big companies?
So some people say that like you say the big companies. So like let's think about Apple, right? So 20 years ago, excuse me, Apple was a big company, but nowhere near as big as they are now, right? And then they launched the iPod, and things began to turn around, right? If you were sort of like an adult, I guess at some level in 2004. Right, you might remember the MP3 player market there was absurd, right? It was just like there was no good MP3 players at all, right? Everything was just basically terrible. And then the iPod comes out, and it's like super easy, has a great user interface, right? And everything was just like it just worked. And so the iPod like totally revolutionized the MP3 player, right? And then a few years later, they released the iPhone, right? So they changed the cell phone market. And the rest is kind of history. Now, since then, right, since the iPhone, what has been like a truly, totally transformative product that Apple has released? Like that has completely changed the way people like live their lives.
Would the Apple Watch be one?
I mean, sort of. So I would say the Apple Watch is probably one, right? Most people, there wasn't really a smartwatch before that, or at least nothing that was any good. Okay, this is maybe a bad question. All right, what else have they done?
Laptops?
Huh?
Laptops?
Laptops have been around for a while. Now, I'll give you that, the Apple laptops are thin, they're very powerful, right? But that's not like a totally game-changing product in the same way that the iPhone was. Is that like the existence of thinner laptops, did it make our lives better? Yes, right? But did it like totally change what you walked out of the house with every single day? Right? Well, not really, right? So here's kind of what I'm trying to get at is, for the most part, companies that are big and major, like Apple, like Google at some level, they tend, so this is a tendency, not an iron rule, they tend to, not make wildly new products. Yes, they make their current product line better every single year. There's no denying that, right? So the iPhone 13 that just came out is way better than the original iPhone. Like, if you don't believe that, then you're wrong. Like, there is no comparison, right? But at the same time, the new iPhone is not like this marvelously huge, fundamental change in technology. It's just better stuff. It's a better camera, bigger hard drive, bigger screen, brighter screen, all that kind of stuff. It's not like this hugely innovative thing. And so what we tend to find is, in a lot of cases, the truly innovative stuff actually comes from the smaller startups. right? Those are the ones that tend to, totally change some market or totally create an all new market that then the other companies kind of copy, right? So I might even push back on the Apple Watch example, because prior to the Apple Watch, there was a company called Pebble, which was a really small startup. It was one of the most successful startups on Kickstarter, I think. It might have been Indiegogo, I don't remember which. But they were a small startup that said, hey, wouldn't it be great to get notifications on your wrist, right? And so they sent out to make a product that did that, right? And they did, and it worked, and they became a big company. And then Apple said, hey, that actually is pretty cool. We're going to do it better, right? And they did. So I might even push back on your example of the Apple Watch, because they weren't the first. They might be the best, right? I don't dispute that, but they weren't the first. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah, Kim.
So when you were talking about this, I know they don't really make anything, but I would say social networking. I think it started off with MySpace, which is pretty much, I believe, no longer existent. I believe, I don't know. And then if you watch the Historically Inaccurate Social Network movie, they didn't invent social networking because MySpace exists, but I feel like they get a lot of the credit these days for having innovated social networking.
Mhm.
And now obviously Facebook is a huge company, but like you said, the smaller companies have basically just duplicated the concept. Instagram, whatever
Yeah,
other now
well,
whatever companies are out there. I
yeah. So
don't
I mean,
remember.
yeah. So I think Facebook is a really good example, right? They took all the successes that, MySpace had, but improved on them. So, there's no denying that Facebook is better than MySpace ever was, right? And then the other thing that they've done, over the years is, they start adding new services. So like I remember when Facebook Messenger didn't exist, right? Like you couldn't do that, right? I remember when when you went to your home screen, it didn't show you news or anything like that. And if you wanted to like communicate with someone or see what someone was up to, you had to actually go to their page and see it there, right? So like they've made steady improvements on the user experience. They've added new features over time, but here's kind of the thing. Facebook bought Instagram to make it easier for them to share pictures, like for the users to share pictures. So that's not really an innovation, that's an acquisition, right? They bought WhatsApp, right? Why did they buy WhatsApp? Well, their Facebook Messenger, like it worked, but it kind of sucked. And they were like, hey, we want to make this better. So what are we going to do? We'll buy WhatsApp. And so they buy WhatsApp, integrate that technology somewhat into Facebook Messenger. And so again, like they're improving stuff, but I wouldn't call that like the same innovation as inventing the concept. Does that kind of make sense? Okay, so the smaller startups here, these are the ones that to me and to a lot of people in this like managerial economicsy field, they're the ones that are doing a lot, right? And then the hope is that they get bought by some big company for billions of dollars, right? And so why is that? Like why is that the case? Why does Facebook or Apple or Google, why do they prefer to take something that someone else does and just make it better, right? Well, if you think about it, if you are like a big major player, do you want to like risk your company's reputation on something that may or may not pan out? Right. So think about, so this is actually, so Google might be a bad example of this, because if you're like a Google user and you're like into that ecosystem, you've probably noticed that Google keeps releasing like a product and then they're like, hey, screw it, we're pulling the plug on this. Right. So Google's reputation now is like, yeah, we start a bunch of stuff and then we cancel it. Right. So like Google Allo, Google Wave was kind of cool. That's gone. Google Music was replaced by YouTube Music, which is vastly inferior in my opinion, but whatever. So Google's kind of reputation is to start something and then like totally change. Contrast that with Apple's. So like if Apple started putting out a whole bunch of products that kind of sucked and then they canceled them, how would all of you who have iPhones and iPads or whatever, how would you all feel about that? right? What's the big selling point about like every single Apple product?
It's easy to use.
Yeah, it's easy to use and like it always just works, right? Like always. There's almost never a problem with any Apple product that can't be really easily solved if a problem arises, right? And that's like kind of huge. So that's their reputation. And so if they started like taking risks on new technologies, new innovations and everything, all of a sudden that reputation would go away. Right? And Apple as a company would probably lose significantly, right? And so the idea, right, is big companies have a lot to lose and very little to actually gain by like being innovative, right? Or by being innovative. They have a lot to gain by making improvements. That's true, right? But they have very little to gain by innovating in the way that we're describing. Okay. When you're small startup company trying to make it, yeah, you can't just copy Apple. It's not going to work. You got to do something truly revolutionary to like get in there. Okay. Does that all kind of make sense? Okay. We can also think of, let's say you and someone else are bargaining, right? And you're trying to get to some agreement. Well, one thing you could do is basically say like, here I stand, right? Where you announce to the other person like, hey, I'm not compromising, like this is where I'm at. You either meet me here or we're done, okay? And so you refuse to negotiate at all. Like that is a negotiation strategy, okay? So to me, like the best example of this is probably Martin Luther, right? Why Martin Luther? What did he like pull off? Those of you that have studied history at some level.
I'm totally guessing, but is that the separation from the Church of England or no?
Yeah, right. So Martin Luther basically went up to the Catholic Church and was like, I got 99 problems, right? And I need you to fix them. And he nailed his treatises to the church door, right? And said, I'm not moving. I'm not compromising on this, right? And he didn't. And what ended up happening? Well, as a result, one, like the Lutheran Church was established, right? But two, the Catholic Church, the largest organization on the entire planet, back then, and probably even today, actually changed. Like they changed some of their stuff, which is nuts, right? If you like stop back and think about that, like one guy got real pissed off and like nailed some paper to a door and said, here I stand, I'm not moving, you move. And the Catholic Church was like, okay, which is wild, right? And so, that's kind of an interesting thing. Now, what's the risk if you do this strategy? So like, should you just walk into like every single interaction and be like, I refuse to compromise and to hell with even talking about this?
I think you lose out on possible opportunity.
Yeah, right. So the risk, right? So, it could work, right? But it could fail spectacularly. Right? You could totally alienate your like opponent or the other person in the negotiation. You could leave them feeling annoyed or cheated, right? Which might cause them, like maybe they'll go with you this one time, but they will never want to interact with you again, right? You'll probably end up making fewer deals, right? Because some people are just going to walk away. So you might miss out on some stuff that even you might be willing to compromise on. So in other words, like, I guess a small compromise in the short term might end up proving, hugely beneficial in the long term, right? Generally speaking, if you want to like get a job, right, or get a raise or anything like that, typically you've got to do the work before you get the pay and demonstrate that you can actually like do it, right? And then you go to your boss and you say, hey, I've been doing this extra work and I've been succeeding at it, and you guys, the employers, have benefited from it. How about a raise, right? And so, but if you like walk into your boss's office, tomorrow and say, I need a 20% raise, I'm not moving, and I will do this extra work to earn that 20% raise, your boss might say yes, but my guess is that they're going to say no until you've proven like, hey, I can handle this. And the easiest way to handle it is, or prove that you can handle it, is to handle it. So go do it, right? And if you can do all that, right, then you can either get a job offer somewhere else, right, or which you can then leverage to a raise at your current employer, or you just go to the other employer. And so like there's all kinds of ways that you can do these kinds of things. We can also think of the phrase here is belling the cat. Right, so like putting a bell around a cat. So the story goes that a family of mice was living in a house, right, and the cat would come and eat them. So they wanted one mouse to like stand guard and look out for the cat, right? But here's kind of the thing: all the mice agreed that wouldn't it be great if one of them would go and look for the cat to see where the cat was, right? But no one wanted to actually do it, right? Why did no mouse want to be the person on lookout, or the mouse on lookout?
Might get caught.
Yeah, you might get caught, right? So every mouse agrees like, hey, someone should do this, but every mouse also agrees that someone else should do it, right? And as a result, no one did it. And so the idea is like, if you could somehow put a bell on the cat, right, then you wouldn't have to stand guard, right? So you could know the cat was coming by listening for the bell. But then you run into the same problem. Who's going to put the bell on the cat? Okay. And so the idea behind belling the cat is twofold, right? One, everyone wins if, I'll just call it like X is done, right? And two, everyone wins if we all work together, right? These are common instantiations of the belling the cat problem. But here's kind of the issue, right? With number one, I win, just as much if someone else does it. Right? And then here's kind of the interesting thing that also holds true. I also win just as much if everyone else works together. Right? So let's think of this in the context of maybe the environment. So can we all agree that if each one of us came to Aquinas College on a Saturday and like picked up trash and pulled the invasive species out of the woods and all that kind of stuff, the campus would be more beautiful, right? And if we got every single Aquinas College student to do it, right, that would be even better, right? But here's kind of the thing: what if every other college person or Aquinas person does it except me? Do I still win? Yeah, there's no possible way that like just me alone is going to be the difference maker between like Aquinas being a beautiful place and Aquinas being like what it is today, which is still beautiful, but like not as beautiful, whatever, right? Well, here's kind of the thing: everyone else has that same assessment, right? And so if everyone agrees that if everyone else did something, they would win just as much as if they did or did not do it, like you as an individual, then what happens? Well, nobody does it, right? So we call this kind of a, if you want a catch-all phrase for this, it is a collective action problem, right? Where, yes, if we all did something, wouldn't that be great, okay? But the problem is we could all just not do it, or if that's true, right, then we all have an incentive to not do it because we could at some level free ride off of it. Okay, does this all kind of make sense about how these are like strategic interactions, between you and multiple other people? Everyone with me on all the examples? Okay, so what we want to do is try to figure out some way to sort of anticipate this. And so what we're going to get into is what we call game theory. Okay, now game theory can get super advanced. It can handle all kinds of cool stuff. We're going to keep it pretty simple because you can, it turns out you can do almost all the work that you need with simple stuff. But if you've ever seen the movie A Beautiful Mind with Russell Crowe, that movie was about a mathematician named John Nash who basically invented game theory, right? And he won a Nobel Prize in economics for it. And so it's kind of a cool, it's a really cool story. I'm actually really impressed with how good it came out. Okay, so how many, are you guys all familiar with like Charlie Brown and Lucy, like in the football, right? So like, what's the story of Charlie Brown and Lucy and the football?
He's about to kick it, and every time she says she's not gonna pull it, she does, and he flies back.
Yeah, right. So Charlie Brown, Lucy says, "Hey Charlie, do you want to kick this ball?" Right? And he says, "No, every time I've done it, you pulled it away at the last second, and I've gone flying up in the air and I land on my back, and then you laugh at me, right?" And then she says, "Oh, well, this time I promise, Charlie, I won't do it." Right? And then, he runs up to kick the ball, he's all excited, and she pulls it away. Right? I don't think he's ever kicked the ball, which is kind of wild, right? Okay, so let's think about this, right? So we can think about this. So the Charlie Brown example, using game theory. Okay, so and specifically, we're going to model this as what we call a sequential game. Okay, and a sequential game is like where one person makes a decision, the other person then responds to that decision, right? So like chess or checkers is a sequential game, right? The alternative, just so you have a sense of it, the alternative is what we call a simultaneous game, right? And so that's where both players make a decision at the same time, and then the outcome is determined by what the players do. So think of like rock, paper, scissors, right? If you've ever played rock, paper, scissors, right? That's a sequential game where, you and your opponent, throw something, right? And then depending on who throws what, right, the winner of the game is determined and the loser of the game is determined, right? Now imagine if we played rock, paper, scissors and you went first, and then I get to pick what I'm going to do after you've already picked your choice, right? Is that game interesting at all? No, right? Because I could always win. Like if you move first and you throw rock, right, and I want to win, I'm just like, okay, cool, paper, we're done, right? And if you threw paper, I'd be like, sweet, scissors, got it, right? Rock, paper, scissors is only interesting if it's a simultaneous game, okay? But let's get back to Charlie Brown. So the way we model this, right, is we would do like what we call a decision tree. Okay, so we could say we've got like Charlie Brown, right? So Lucy has made the offer like, hey, do you want to come kick the ball? Right? Charlie Brown can say, yes, or he can say no, right? And if he says no, we just say, the game ends. Nothing happens, okay? And next, I'll make this, blue, I guess. Lucy, right? Well, she can pull the ball away, right? Or she can let Charlie kick it, right? And she has those two options, once you get to that point, okay? And so like this, I'm just gonna erase this so I have more space, right? This right here is what we would call like a decision tree, right? And the way to read it is that the choices are made from, left to right. Okay, so Charlie Brown goes first, Lucy goes second, right? And that's like the order that you've drawn it, or you draw it in. Some people do like top down, right? So they start at the top and they go to the bottom. Some people, this is where the tree part comes from, is they'll move from the bottom up. I like going left to right. I just find it easier to read, right? Because if you have something that goes up, the tree looks more like a tree. Okay, right. I just find it easier to draw and think about and read if it goes, left to right. Okay. And so this right here, like, it tells us some stuff. It lets us see, what the game is going to look like. But from this, we can't really determine like so what we're concerned about is like, what should Charlie Brown do? Right? What we're trying to figure out is if we're Charlie Brown, what should we do if we face this? And so in order to make that assessment, we've got to put some like payoffs in here, right? So we got to have like numbers that say, what each player gains from playing these things. So let's put those in, right? So I'm going to start with parentheses, and let me just write the numbers in real quick, color coded and everything. And I will then explain, what they are. Okay, so 100, 10, 0. Okay, so here, right, the idea is that bigger numbers are better. So you want to have the biggest number that you can at the end of the game. Charlie Brown doesn't, in this context, he doesn't care about Lucy's payoff, and Lucy doesn't care about Charlie Brown's payoff, right? So we're not looking for like the biggest sum of the payments or the numbers, right? We're just looking for like a specific number. Okay. And so remember, like the idea is that the order of decision making is going to go, this way. We're going to start at the left and then we'll go to the right. But the way we're going to reason through it is actually to go through it backwards, right? And so this concept that we're going to start covering right now is called backwards induction. And I'm willing to bet that you've all done something like this at some point, okay? And so the way we do it is we imagine, hey, what if Charlie Brown says yes, right? So let's say Charlie Brown says yes. What will Lucy do? And to figure out the answer to that, we look at these two numbers here, right? And Lucy wants to pick the number that's the highest. And so since 100 is bigger than 10, right? At least according to most mathematicians, right?
How did you get those numbers again?
I made them up.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay. So in this case, I've made these numbers up, but we'll get, you can put other numbers in and we'll see how that changes things. Okay. So here, right, Lucy is choosing between 100 if she pulls it away, or 10 if she lets Charlie Brown kick the ball, right? So, what I'm trying to get at is that Lucy's actually not a total sociopath. She would get some enjoyment out of seeing Charlie Brown kick the ball, but she gets more enjoyment from seeing him fall on his face or his back, right? Okay, so given that, which one is Lucy going to pick? Well, she's going to pick the 100, which means we can eliminate this as a potential outcome, right? So what I'm saying is we know that if Charlie Brown says yes, Lucy will pull the ball, there we go. Lucy will pull the ball away. Does that kind of make sense? Okay, so if Charlie Brown knows that, okay, then he now faces a decision, right? He can say yes, right? He can go this way, in which case he'll get a payoff of -10, right? Or he can go this way, in which case he gets a payoff of 0, right? And 0 is bigger than -10. And so what we would say is that Charlie Brown is going to not choose to say yes, right? And we're going to get to this point here. Does that kind of make sense how I've solved this game? Okay, so let's think about a different example where the answer is not from pop culture. All right, so this was actually one that I constructed, and I may have shown my now wife on our first date this decision tree. Fortunately, she thought it was funny, so whatever. So I'm Dave. My wife's name is Julie. Okay, so before our first date, I faced an option, right? I could ask her out. Oops, I'll write that clearer. So ask out, right? Or I could not, right? And if I don't ask her out, hey, 0-0, right? Because if you don't ask someone out, you don't face the sting of rejection. So there you are, right? Julie, on the other hand, right? So she gets the choice next. Julie could accept, right? Or she could reject. Okay. And so let's I guess I could do this. I gotta make this color code. Oops, shoot, wrong thing. 0 and then 0. Okay. Now, if Julie said yes to my date proposal, I would have been very happy, right? 100 units of happiness. This is amazing. If she rejected me, I would have felt really embarrassed and sad, -20, right? Now for Julie, if she said yes, clearly she will be very happy, right? That's obviously intuitive. And if she says no, she'll feel bad, but not as bad as I do, right? She's a nice person. She just feels bad saying no to people. Okay, so let's pretend that you're me. So remember, our choices are made in this order, but we're gonna backwards induct, which means we're gonna think about it this way. Okay, so if these payoffs are true and everyone knows them and all that good stuff, right? If I ask out Julie, what would she say? And how do you know? All right, and don't cheat and be like, you guys are married, so clearly she said yes.
Yes, because she would, I guess, get the 100.
Yeah, right. And the 100 is bigger than the -5, right? And so what we can say is she definitely won't reject me if I ask her out for a date. And so now I face the choice of asking her out and then going on a date and getting a happiness of 100, or not asking her out and getting a happiness of 0. And if I want to maximize my happiness, what should I do? Well, I should ask her out, in which case she'll say yes. Is that kind of so far so good? Andy, you with me? Okay, cool. Okay, so we can do that. Now let's do a much more complicated one. And for this, I'm actually just going to share the other screen because I don't want to redraw it because it's a pain in the ass. Right, so let's do that. Okay, so you can all see that we can get a much more complicated game with a lot more chains of reasoning. And I'm going to send you guys these slides, so don't feel like you have to like rush to write them down unless that helps you. Right, so let's think about this. How do I go through this puzzle? So if okay, so we can see me. Cool. Can I mark this up? Maybe. Oh boy, we might get real fancy. Nope. Okay, cannot do that. Never mind. Okay, so we're not going to get fancy, unfortunately. Oh, yes, I can. Ha! Oh, you little. Hang on. Yes, cool. I can do that. All right. So how do we solve this game? Right. Well, once again, right, we're going to think through it. It's going to be made this way, but we're going to think through it. This is so much harder to write with this way, right? So what we need to do is imagine that we are at this position here, right? So so the game here is like ask Julie out, right? She can say yes or no, right? Then eventually Dave could propose or not propose, right? And if I propose, Julie could say yes or she could say no, right? And so let's say I have proposed to Julie, right? What is she gonna say if I propose to her? And this is pretending, this is from before we were married.
think she'll say no.
Yeah, she should decline, right? Because -10 is worse than or is better than -20, right? So we get rid of this one. Okay. So now, if we were back here, right? If I knew that, if I knew she was going to say no, would I propose to her? No, I would pick don't propose because 50 is bigger than -100, right? Okay, so now we know that if we're here, right, we'll end up here, which means we will not get to this point. Does that make sense? Okay, so now we go back to, get that, we go back to Julie now has the next decision, right? So she knows that if I ask her out, she can accept, in which case I will not propose, right? Or she can decline, right? So what would she do then? Should she go on the date with me? The very first date. And how do you know?
50 is larger than -5.
Yeah, 50 is larger than -5, right? So Julie will not choose this, right? And so then we get all the way back to me, right? At the very outset of this like potential relationship, should I ask Julie out? In which case I know she'll say yes, and she knows I won't propose, or should I just say skip it? What should I do? Should I ask out should I have asked out Julie on that first date? Yeah, right? Because
Yes.
then we'll get to this point here where we go out on dates, but we never actually get married. Right? Okay, now we can say, since we did eventually get married, what must have happened? Well, clearly my payoff didn't change, right? Because I'm still going to be like 100% happy. Julie's payoff must have changed, right? And specifically, it must have gotten higher than 0, right? And so what happened over the course of so think of it this way, like if you go out on a first date and someone like on the next night they call you and say, hey, you want to get married, right? You're gonna be like, whoa, go away, this is terrifying, right? So what happens over time is like these numbers all change, right? As you get to learn, more about each other, et cetera, right? Numbers change, and then the result changes as well. But you can model even like this kind of stuff with game theory, right? And understand, some pretty cool stuff, right? And so just so you're aware, yes, I use this stuff all the time. I don't usually make up numbers, but I like try to assign appropriate numbers to things at the end, because obviously I can't go ask my wife like, hey, if I did X, Y, and Z, right, how many units of happiness would you have, right? But I can because I know her at least a little bit, I can assign some numbers to things and be like kind of accurate, right? And then I can actually like backwards induct and figure out what to do. So she's always like, how come you don't really, why don't you ask me stuff? I'm like, oh, because I already figured it out. Game theory, right? Don't have to. Right? I know, it's amazing, right? That got a chuckle out of Andy. Okay, so the end result here, right, is I should ask out my wife and we should never get married, but the numbers changed, and so we did, right? We actually used this together. So I taught her, she's a doctor at the hospital downtown, but I had to teach her game theory because we had this question come up recently. How many kids should we have? Right? So I don't know what you know about like procreation, but like how many people are involved to like make a baby? Yeah, it's 2, right? It takes 2 to make that. But here's the thing, once you've had 1 baby, like you can have 2, right? You can have 3, you can have 7, whatever number you want. You can just keep on trucking, right? And so, you want to know like, hey, how many kids should we have, right? Well, okay, we made a decision tree, right? So Dave asked Julie, right? Julie got to say, yes or no, right? Yes, no, right? If yes, how many, right? And so we had lots of options, right? You could have 1, 2, 3, 4 or more, right? And then we just like talked about how our lives would be, you know, if we had these things. And so I just assigned some numbers to it, right? And we kind of settled on like, hey, this is the right number, right? And so like, hey, it turns out we're having kid number 2 in January. So hooray. Right now we can do other things. So we could think about like advertising using game theory. Okay, so like let's say it's you and some other company are in, you know, the same industry, right? So let's say it's you know, firm, let's call it firm 1 to be really original, right? They face a decision, should they advertise or not? All right, I'm just gonna leave the light off because screw it, I'm tired of it, right? The second firm, right? They can decide to, you know, advertise or not, right? And they can do that down here too, right? They can advertise or not, right? And then there'll be, you know, payoffs at the end, right? Now, if you have, here's kind of my next question to you. Do you think simultaneous games are, you know, the accurate way to think about the decision to advertise? So like, let's say this is, you know, Aquinas, and let's say this is Cornerstone, right? Those sons of bitches over there, right? Yeah, Hunter's like, don't like them, right? We don't know why we hate them, but like for whatever reason, Cornerstone's a rival, and fine, whatever.
Listen, we were running preseason conditioning on the track, and I had to run an extra sprint for them, and I have no idea why, and so I hate them. So
There you go, done, right? There's your reason. That's enough reason for me. I hate them too, right? Those damn Jesuits or whatever they are, right? Okay, so there, it's all their fault. Just come be the real religion, which is Catholic, obviously. Okay, not that I have to say that because I can see the chapel from here, but whatever. Okay, so do you think Cornerstone waits to decide if they're going to do an advertising campaign based on whether we do, or vice versa? Like, is President Quinn like looking out a telescope at Cornerstone being like, I wonder if they're advertising? Probably not, right? And so here it might make sense to model this, instead of as a sequential game, as a simultaneous game, right? And this actually, so this came up as I'll give you a much more a real world example that actually matters, right? So how many of you have ever heard of like tobacco or cigarettes? Have you ever heard of these things? Once or twice in passing, right? What are they? What are cigarettes? It's not a trick, right? They're like, right? It's like you smoke a cigarette, you're like, yeah, I'm cool, right? Is that how that works, right? So here's kind of the thing about tobacco companies. Okay, they can advertise or they cannot, right? And what do you think is the number one determinant of whether or not someone is going to start smoking? Like, what is the thing that predicts most accurately whether or not you or someone you know is about to start smoking or will be a smoker?
I think they say if your parent is a smoker, then you're more
Yeah.
likely to be a smoker.
Yeah. It's almost always whether or not your parent was a smoker. So the latest I've seen is like if one of your parents is a smoker and the other one's not, you're something like 5 times more likely to start smoking. And if both of your parents are smokers, you're something like 20 times more likely to start smoking, right? But here's kind of the other thing. Advertising for tobacco products. So some of you might remember tobacco advertising. It's like you drive down the road and there'd be a big billboard with like Joe Camel on it, riding in a cool like pink sports car-y thing, you know, smoking his cigarette, being awesome, right? If you've watched Happy Days, right, the Fonz, right, he smokes and he's the cool character. Like, it used to be the case that the good guys and girls, right, in movie, mostly guys, right, the good people in movies were the smokers because they were cool and everybody wanted to be cool, right? And so now there we are. But now it's the opposite, right? So what we've found is that advertising for cigarettes doesn't increase the number of people who smoke. But what it did do is it changes who or what brand of cigarettes the existing smokers smoke. Does that kind of make sense? Right. So like Camel advertising cigarettes probably won't generate brand new smokers, but it might steal some Marlboro smokers away from Marlboro and bring them to Camel. Does that make sense?
Just out of curiosity, where are how do tobacco companies even market anymore? Because I don't see them in magazines, and I definitely don't see them on billboards. So just out of curiosity, where are they?
We're gonna get to that one, right?
Ah.
But they're in magazines that, let's just phrase it this way: the advertising for cigarettes is in magazines that children cannot legally like buy.
Oh, okay. So
We'll just
magazines,
leave
I
it there.
probably look.
Yeah, right. So if you're not reading those magazines, you're not seeing any advertising. So there you are, right? So we've learned something about Kim. She does not read those magazines. Okay. So let's think of it let's think of the tobacco example like this way. Okay. So we can have let me think. Let's put a pin in that one, and we'll do a more classic example, and then we'll bring back the tobacco. Okay, so this is called, oops, hang on. This is called the prisoner's dilemma. Okay, and the idea is that you have two prisoners or two people, so we'll call them, player one and player two. They can, and they're being questioned they're both in jail. Okay, and they're being questioned. So the police know like someone did some crime. They don't know which one of these people did, right? But they're going to try to get the criminals to confess. Okay, and so they ask them like, hey, if you rat out the other person, we'll give you a reduced sentence. Okay, and so like that's the game, right? So but if you keep your mouth shut, then you both get, some sentence, right? So you can cooperate with the other player. So you would, in this case, you would not talk to the police, right? And here you can cooperate. I'm just going to change this to a co-op, right? Or you can cheat the other prisoner. Okay. And so if you cheat, you're ratting out, the other person. Okay. And so if you both cooperate, let's say you will both spend, if you both keep your mouth shut, you'll each spend 3 years in jail. Okay. And if you both rat out the other person, then you both spend 8 years in jail. Okay. But if player one keeps their mouth shut and player two rats out player one spends 12 years in jail and player two only spends 1 year in jail. Does that kind of make sense? All right, so they get like credit for, helping the investigation or whatever. And then the other one is true too. So if player two keeps his mouth shut and player one rats out player two, then player one gets rewarded with a reduced sentence and player two spends 12 years in jail. Okay, so so let's just kind of like go through, and I'm going to move this one just to have some more space. Okay, so the way to read this is left to right, kind of. So like player one's payoffs are always going to be the first number. Okay, and player two's payoffs will always be the second, right? And the idea is, this number one is left of this number two. And so the numbers that they receive are on the left-hand side of each cell. Does this kind of make sense? Okay, so let me clear out all these things. Oops, wrong one. son of a bitch. All right, well, whatever, screw it. Also, I shouldn't swear. There we go, got it. Yahtzee. Okay, and then we'll make that a 1. Okay, so how do we actually go about solving, this game? So let's pretend that we're player 1. Okay, so we're player 1, and we want to figure out like what should we do. All right, so first off, do we want to spend more time in jail or less time in jail?
Less.
Yeah, I would prefer to not be in jail, right? And I don't really know what it's like. I spent one night in jail and when I was 20, because it turns out I did the heinous thing of having a beer on my birthday. And the cops were like, guess what, Dave? You get to go, spend the night in jail. And I was like, well, this is awful, right? So I, unlike other people who have been to jail, I am afraid to go back and I don't want to. Okay, so let's pretend like we're player 1. And let's pretend that we knew that player 2 was going to cooperate, that they were going to keep their mouths shut and not rat us out. Okay, so if that's the case, then we're looking at, this column, and player 1, we have the choice between 3 years in jail or 1 year in jail. So which one are we going to pick? Yeah, 1 year in jail, right? Okay, so we would say like if player 2 is going to cooperate, then we're going to play cheat, right? And here's kind of the other thing. If we knew that player 2 was going to cheat, what would we do? Right, so now we're looking at, this column here, right? Would we want to keep our mouths shut or cooperate, or I'm sorry, keep our mouths shut or rat out player 2? All right, so we're thinking about the 12 or the 8.
Cheat.
You're also going to cheat.
Yeah, you're also going to cheat, right? And so what we can say, right, is that no matter what player 2 does, it's always better for us if we cheat. Does that kind of make sense? Yes? Cool. Okay. Okay, so in this case, what we would say is that player 1 has a dominant strategy. Okay, a dominant strategy is one that you do or that you would want to do no matter what the other person does. Right, so no matter what player 2 does, player 1 is always better off if they play cheat. Is that so far so good? Okay, so let's get rid of that. Now let's imagine that we are player 2. Right, so we're going to imagine that we're player 2 now. And let's say that we know that player 1 is going to cooperate. And so what that means is that we are thinking about, these 2 cells here, and we're thinking about the 3 or the 1, right? And so in this case, would player 2 want to cooperate or cheat if player 1 was cooperating?
Player 2 would cheat.
Yeah, they would cheat, right? And we can do the same thing down here. If we knew that player 1 was going to cheat, right? So I'll move that down. Oops, whatever, wrong color. Then we're thinking about these cells here. So we're thinking about the 12 or the 8, right? So if we were player 2 and we knew player 1 was going to cheat, right? What would we do? Yeah, we'd also cheat, right? So again, no matter what player 1 does, player 2 has a dominant strategy of cheating, right? And so what we say is, both players here have a dominant strategy. Both of their dominant strategies are to cheat. And so the final result of this interaction should be both players cheating and both of them spending 8 years in jail. Right, and this is kind of weird because if they would both cooperate, they could get out of jail in 3 years, right? But moving diagonally in a game like this requires you to work with the other person, right? You by yourself can't move the outcome diagonally. You could, if you were player one, you could move it this way, right? But that would just mean that you'd spend more time in jail, right? And so you don't want to do that. You could, if you were player two, you could move if you're player one, you can move up and down, right? So, but if you did that, you'd spend more time in jail, right? And so you don't want to deviate from this strategy unless you have some kind of assurance that the other person is going to come along with you. But notice that if you did, like if you said, hey, let's, cooperate together, let's both keep our mouths shut. Well, you're asking them basically to spend 2 more years in jail than they have to, right? Because they could just keep their mouths shut, right? And things would be better. Or you could keep your mouth shut and things would be better for you. Does that kind of make sense? Right? And so that's the challenge of situations like the prisoner's dilemma. Okay, so now let's apply this to the tobacco industry. Okay, so we could have firm one and firm two, right? And they have the choice of, advertising or not, advertising or not. Okay. Now, what we found is that if both firms advertise, right, the net effect, so like if Marlboro advertises really hard and Camel advertises really hard, what ends up happening is no, customers actually, like the net change in customers is basically zero. So like Marlboro might lose, 100,000 customers to Camel, but Camel is also going to lose about 100,000 smokers to Marlboro. And so they're both going to be, equally well off, right, in terms of the number of customers. But advertising costs, money, right? Now, if they both decided not to advertise, what happens to the customer base? I might have phrased that question weird, right? So think of it this way, like if advertising doesn't influence your decision of whether or not to smoke, but it does influence your decision of what cigarettes to smoke, right? And if there just wasn't any advertising, well, then there should still be no effect on the number of customers that each company gets, right? Okay. And here's the thing. How much money does not advertising cost? Yeah, big fat zero. So like $0 spent, right, by both companies, right? Now, if one of the firms advertises, so let's say firm one advertises and firm two does not, right? What happens then? Well, firm one gains, a whole bunch of customers, and firm two loses a whole bunch of customers, right? And we could say the same over here, right? If firm two advertised and firm one did not, then customers flow from firm one to firm two. That so far so good, right? So here's kind of what ends up happening in a game like this is you end up getting stuck right here, right? And we've seen instances, so we've got the reports from the company meetings and whatnot. So the big tobacco companies would all meet, together in secret to try to convince one another not to advertise. But invariably, somebody would advertise, and then the whole thing fell apart. And so what ends up happening is you get stuck in that advertise equilibrium where you're all spending a whole bunch of money and you're not getting anything for it. But if you didn't spend that money, you would lose even more money in the form of lost customers. Does that make sense so far? Okay. So what you want, if you're a tobacco company, what you would have wanted at the time is to move diagonally. But we just said diagonal moves are really difficult, right? So Kim pointed out that we seem to be in this equilibrium point here, right? Where we just don't have nearly as much advertising for tobacco products as we used to. And so how did we pull off, or how did the tobacco industry pull off that diagonal move? Right? Because it happened. So like, how did it happen?
Legally?
Yeah. So it turns out the tobacco, so it's now illegal to advertise cigarettes in places where children might see it. Okay. Which is why the advertisements are all in those magazines that like kids can't see, right? Or they're in like R-rated movies. So it turns out, with very few exceptions, there are always exceptions to this. So like Wolverine in the X-Men movies smokes. Okay. But that's a character like trait of the character, and he's not the same if he doesn't smoke. So they got an exception for that. But in movies, who like today, who is the smoker? Is it the good guy or the bad guy?
Like bad guy, like mobsters.
Yeah, the monsters, the ne'er-do-wells, right? The insidious people, right? They're the ones that are like, right? So if you want to know, like if you want a clue into TV movies or like who's the bad guy in whatever series you might be watching, look for who's smoking. They're the bad guy, right? And that's true, right? And you've been like conditioned to associate evil with smoking or smoking with evil, right? And the idea is that children will see these movies, they'll start believing like, hey, only bad guys and girls smoke, therefore I don't want to be a bad person, therefore I won't smoke, right? That's the idea. It used to be that the cool people smoked. So if you watch like old movies with like Cary Grant, right, or any of those people, you know, they smoke all the time because that's what cool people do, right? I'm being like somewhat facetious, but at the time that was true. And so what happened, right, is we changed the law. But what group of people do you think was like the big influencers behind getting that law changed or that law passed? Who lobbied Congress to make that change happen?
Parents.
Yeah, almost everyone says parents, but here's the thing. Most parents are broke and can't afford to actually lobby Congress.
Tobacco companies.
Yeah, turns out it was the tobacco companies that lobbied Congress. Why did they lobby Congress to make it illegal to advertise? So like imagine that you went before Congress and said, hey, listen, we think it should be illegal to advertise our products to children, right? And then, you know, Congress will be like, okay, cool, just like don't do it, right? And they're like, we can't stop ourselves. We can't stop ourselves from doing it. It can't be done. We need you to make it illegal for us to do something that we know is bad, right? Like that's an absurd claim, but it's only absurd if you don't understand game theory, right? Hang on. Okay. And so why did they seek the law? Because they wanted to move diagonally to where they wouldn't have to pay money and no one was going to be allowed to defect or to cheat on the agreement of not advertising, right? The end result, just so you might be, if you're interested in this at all, the end result, so prior to this law change, there were like 75 different tobacco companies. They were all much smaller, right? The cigarettes were, you know, much more, they were different, obviously, but there was like competition for providing cigarettes, which is kind of weird. But most people, like, as we learned that cigarettes were bad for you, companies have actually responded and made the cigarettes, you know, a little bit healthier. So they're not healthy. Don't misinterpret what I'm saying. It is not good for you to be smoking. But if you were going to smoke, it's less unhealthy for you today than it would have been, you know, 50 years ago. That's my claim. Okay. But if you think about it, that competition would have kept the price low and it would have kept sort of like the quality high in the tobacco market. But now, after that law passed, the only companies that could remain basically were like the really big ones, right? One, because they could afford the advertising in those magazines that we're not going to really go into specifics about, right? So they could afford that, you know, advertising. But two, they had sort of the brand name recognition. And so what they ended up doing is they ended up buying up all the small companies. And now there's like 3 or 4 major tobacco firms in the entire country that sell all the cigarettes, all the tobacco products, right? And that sounds kind of anti-competitive. And for the most part, we're pretty much against like, anti-competitiveness in the US. Why do you think the cigarette companies are all really pissed off at vaping?
Because they got to advertise.
Yeah, so one, vaping is not tobacco, right? It wasn't at the time at least classified as a tobacco product. So they could advertise wherever they wanted, right? They weren't subject to the same rules as the tobacco industry, and it was a new competitor, right? And so what did the tobacco industry try to do? They tried to convince Congress that vaping is the same thing as cigarettes, and it should be classified that way and subject to all the same rules, as an attempt to basically shut down that whole industry. Right now, I don't know. I'm not claiming to be the kind of doctor that can tell you if vaping is good for you or bad for you. I have no idea. Most people don't know either, right? But I feel like giving tobacco companies competition is probably a good thing. But I don't know. Maybe not. Okay. But anyway, this is kind of like the idea. So we can use game theory to understand some stuff that previously probably didn't make any sense. Does that kind of make sense? Okay, so there's a couple like quick rules to kind of go through here, or to think about when thinking about game theory, right? So the first one, if you have a dominant strategy, you should play it, right? So if you have a dominant strategy, use it. If you don't, be prepared to be taken advantage of, right? So like that prisoner's dilemma thing, right? If you don't take advantage of your dominant strategy, you should be prepared to spend 12 years in jail, right? Because that's the likely outcome. Okay. The other, so let's do this example. Let's say we have, player 1, player 2, and we have up and down, and then we have left and right, and we have 10, 7, 8, 5, 7, 12, 4, 3. Also, if you guys want to break, like, say the word. No? Okay. So let's see if you can figure out player 1's dominant strategy in this game. All right, and remember, so 1 is these numbers.
Go down.
I'm so sorry. So I should have prefaced this. Generally, higher numbers are better. Right. Obviously, with the jail, higher numbers were bad. So in this case, higher numbers are better.
Oh my God. He's going up.
Yeah. Sorry, whoever just said "oh my God" in the background. Right. So in this case, player 1's dominant strategy is going to be up. Right. And what about player 2? Do they have a dominant strategy?
Going left.
Yeah, it should be left, right? So the way to tell, right? So for the up, right, is you can see like the 10 is bigger than the 7, right? So they're going to play up if player 2 plays left, and the 8 is bigger than the 4, right? So if player 2 plays right, player 1 is still going to play up, and then for the column player or player 2, right? 7 is bigger than 5, and 12 is bigger than 3, right? And so left is always preferred, right? So you would end up in this box here. Is that so far so good? Okay. There we are. Now, the other thing to consider is, so far, these games have been relatively simple, right? We've had, a dominant strategy for both players, right? We've also had what we could call a dominated strategy. Right, so if a dominant strategy is, you always play, whatever that dominant strategy is. A dominated strategy is you never play, whatever that strategy is. Right? Economists, we're boring in terms of naming stuff, right? We name it for exactly what it is, right? Dominant means like it dominates all other ones. Dominated means that it is dominated by all other strategies. Okay. And so one thing you could, always want to do, another way to solve these games is to look for, dominated strategies and then just eliminate them. Okay. So let's say we had something a little more complicated. So what if we had, let's call it player 1 and player 2. And, we'll do generic stuff up and down. And then we could play left, middle, and right. Okay, so now we're making this a little bit more complicated. We're adding some options here. And let's say this is 3, -3, 7, -7, 15, -15, 9, hang on, I'll do this. I'm going to do this a little bit differently. Okay, so let's make this really easy. So we'll do 3, 7, 15, 9, 8, and 10. And here's the way I'm going to posit this. Okay. You could do, this. Oops. Oops. Player 1, let's say they want big numbers, and player 2, they want small numbers. Okay. If you're curious, this is usually referred to as the football problem. Right. And usually player 1 is, the offense, player 2 is the defense, right? And you could have, run or pass, counter run, counter pass, blitz. But we're just going to do generic stuff. So player 1 wants big numbers, player 2 wants small numbers. Okay. So does anyone have a dominant strategy? All right, so let's start trying to figure out if player 1 has a dominant strategy.
You're asking for player 1's dominant strategy?
What is it?
Wouldn't it be going down? Because
Yep.
all those numbers are bigger?
Yeah, right. So so player 1's dominant strategy is going to be to play down, right? Because 9 is bigger than 3, 8 is bigger than 7, 10. Oh no, sorry, 10 is not bigger than 15.
Ooh.
Yeah. Right. So, oops, wrong one. Okay. So, player 1 doesn't have a dominant strategy, right? They seem to, but when you get to that last one, they don't, right? What about player 2? Do they have a dominant strategy? Right, remember, they want small numbers.
Left.
Let's see. So if they if player 1 plays up, then they can choose 3. Oops, God, I did the wrong one again. they can choose. I'm on the wrong. There we go. So okay. So player one plays left. I'm playing. So player one plays up. Then 3. I need a. There we go. 3 is the smallest of 3, 7, and 15. And if player 2 plays down, then 8 is the smallest number, right? So they don't have a dominant strategy either,
Huh.
right? So how would we solve this game? Well, let's think about this, right? If you're player 2, are you ever going to play right?
No, because it's a dominated strategy.
Yeah, so right would be a dominated strategy, right? And so we know that player 2 is never going to choose to play right. No matter what happens, that's not going to be a result, right? And so we can eliminate it. We can say, hey, screw it. That's never going to happen, right? And if it's never going to happen, player 1 doesn't have to think about it either. And so now we have a question. Does player 1 now have a dominant strategy, knowing that player 2 is never going to play right? Well, the answer is yes, down, right? Because no matter what player 2 does, since we know they're never going to play right, playing down is always better. And now the question becomes, if player 2 knows that player 1 is always going to play down, what would they do? Well, they would play middle. You guys see how I solved that one? Right, so at the outset, nobody had a dominant strategy. But once we eliminated the dominated strategy, which was player 2 playing right, then player 1 had a dominant strategy of down. And because of that, and because we know that they're going to play their dominant strategy, player 2, can pick left or middle, and they'll play middle. Does that make sense? Annalie, you with me? Mostly, or yes?
Mostly I'll probably have to rewatch this one later.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so here the thing I'm trying to illustrate is, you can eliminate the dominated strategies. All right, and if you do that, then you might find that someone somewhere has a dominant strategy and then play it. Okay, so the 3 big lessons from so far, right, are basically you want to look ahead and reason back, right? The second one is play dominant strategies. When possible. And then 3 is eliminate dominated strategies. Okay. Now, if you keep, just these 3 things in mind, right? You're going to be at a huge advantage when it comes to, thinking through how different people, different businesses, different groups, et cetera, are going to be interacting with one another, and consequently influencing one another's, the outcomes that we all have to live with, right? You also have a cool framework that you can use to analyze how to improve your business decision-making process. Oftentimes, the kind of unfortunate thing about life is, you'll be left at some sort of a crossroads where you'll think something like, man, if only the other person would just do whatever, it would be better for both of us, but I know that they're not going to do it, on their own accord or on their own volition, right? And so what you can do, so how do you solve that? Like if you, let's say you actually, let's say you had a simultaneous game, right? So you got some simultaneous game, and let's say you're stuck in like, this is the bad outcome, right? So you're in like a prisoner's dilemma type situation, and this is the good outcome, right? How can you solve this? Right? Because we've both said like, hey, we've said, moving diagonally is hard. It requires the other person to do something, usually kind of against their own volition or against their own self-interest, right? So how could we do this? Right? Because oftentimes as a manager, you're going to be asked to like figure out a solution to this. Like, what would you do?
Find a way to get both parties to move to be forced to do the good outcome. So the
Yeah.
lobbying type
Okay.
situation.
Yeah, so you could like pass a law, right? That's one way. But that can take a long time and it can be really, really expensive, right? And usually you have to be pretty rich to do it, right? So that might not be, so that's an easy way to do it, right? What's like another like way that anyone can do, even if they're not rich? Right? What if you just had a meeting? Right? You could have a meeting with the other person and say, hey, let's work together, let's work something out, right? Maybe there's some weird way that you could convince them, right? So you could have like communication, open up lines of communication with the other person. Maybe you could even like pay them, right? So you could just like literally bribe them in some weird way. But in this case, it's not bribing them in the same way that like, you do for like college admission. Right?
We should
But-
consider this more like cooperation.
The
Okay.
snipes I hit at the beginning.
Who's in the background?
I'm sorry, I'm totally in the esports lab at Aquinas.
Ah, okay. That's fine. I just like keep hearing. I'm like, what the hell's going on? Okay. So you could somehow pay them, right? You could, try to appeal to humanity, right? And be like, hey, you should be a nice person and like do this because nice people do this kind of stuff, right? That's certainly one way to do it. You ever notice companies in the same industry releasing a joint statement? Why would they do that? So I'll just write down.
Is it like an announcement of cooperation, like public?
Yeah, right. So if you like do it in public, so here's kind of the thing, right? The challenge in a lot of these contexts is the same challenge that you face if you play like rock, paper, scissors as a sequential game, right? Where like I throw a rock and then you get to pick what you do next, right? You could make all the promises in the world that you want, right? Or think when when I was making fun of Hunter, right? And I said, hey, if you and I like got in a fight and we had like money on the line, I might try to sucker punch him. Okay, remember we talked about like how I would like kick his ass if I got one really good punch in, but realistically, he'd probably beat me up. I can't tell if Hunter's still here or not.
I'm definitely here.
There you are. Yeah, there you are. Okay, so yeah, so you guys remember that? Like we talked about that one.
I do.
Okay. Yeah, you're like, hell yeah, I'm gonna beat my professor's ass, right? Okay, so of course you remember that one, right? So the challenge, right, is that at any given time, anyone who is like into an agreement, like they can always like renege on it, right? That's why using the law is so powerful because you literally can't. You go to jail if you break the law, right? So what you need is some way to make it costly for the other person to do that, right? And so what we see is in situations where like this stuff happens and you want to move diagonally and you know that a diagonal move is beneficial for both of you, but ultimately really difficult to pull off. What we see are companies announcing sort of or having like a joint statement or issuing a joint statement together saying like, hey, we are working together on this thing. We are going to accomplish it, right? And in that way, you've now made the public the thing that's enforcing the cooperation. Does that kind of make sense? Right? So here's kind of the mystery other thing. So I forget, is it Target? I think it's Target. Target has recently announced that they're going to kick off their Black Friday sales early. And if you buy something from Target and another store offers it for a lower price within like 2 or 3 weeks of you buying it, they will give you the money, the difference in price, right? Best Buy used to do this all the time. They had the Best Buy price match guarantee, where if you found a lower price, right, you could go into Best Buy and they would give you the difference plus 10%, right? So like if you bought something for $300 and you found it somewhere else for $240, right, they would give you the $60 and then they would give you another $6 on top of that, right? Why would Best Buy do that? All right, so I'm going to end the sharing screen portion if I can figure out how to do that. Come here. There we go. Stop sharing. So why would Best Buy agree to something like that? Like, why would they promote something like that?
Is it because it's better for them to have a sale of an item than a return? So if someone were to like find a better deal, they could return the item.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so that's certainly one aspect of it. So, you know, most companies will sell, like if you return something, you know, the company doesn't just like throw it away. They repackage it, you know, tape it back up and they sell it at a discount as an open box item, right? And so Best Buy wants to avoid, you know, you doing that, right? And so maybe they do it for that reason. Why else might they do it?
I
They
would
can
think,
kind
Let's go Andy and then Kim. I'll settle this one.
I was gonna say they can take advantage of the advertising from other companies. So if
Okay.
somebody sees it in the paper that at a different place, then they might say, oh, I can get it at Best Buy for whatever reason.
Okay.
At the same price.
So yeah, so they could be just taking advantage of other people's advertising efforts. And, you know, since Best Buy is such a big company and they sell so many different things, maybe someone will be like, hey, you know, I saw this electronic product at a different store. I bet Best Buy also sells it. Let's go there, right? That could be part of it. Kim, what do you think?
I just know that if I'm looking at something, let's say I'm at Best Buy and I'm looking at something, I'm doing my research, talking to a salesperson. It kind of eliminates that. Well, maybe it'll go on sale down the road. So it's going to get that initial purchase.
Mhm.
So there's just not that. Okay, well, let me see if it gets cheaper in a month or in a couple of weeks at Black Friday. So you're just going to get that initial purchase.
Yeah, it might put customer minds at ease, which, you know, usually goes a long way toward making a sale. Okay, so what if I'm going to put forth a more, so you're all listing like good reasons why Best Buy would do this, right? Like altruistic or, you know, perhaps like competent business decisions on, you know, inventory management and that kind of stuff. I'm going to put forth a more nefarious one, right? And we do have some evidence that so like all your answers are right. I don't want to say that you're wrong. Okay, but we do also have evidence that there was a a nefarious reason for it as well, and why the minus 10% part has mostly gone away. Okay, so what these big electronic companies used to do is they would actually meet together in secret and say, hey, let's charge like a higher price to all of our customers. So we're going to all agree to raise prices by a little bit, right? Because if we all raise prices, then customers will have to pay the higher price, right? Like if you can't comparison shop at another store because they have the same high price, then all the stores just make more money, okay? But here's kind of the thing. If I agree to raise my prices, and let's say like Andy runs like let's say Andy and I are in cahoots with each other. Right? I'm going to pick on Andy tonight. Okay, so Andy and I are in cahoots with one another, and I go up to Andy and I say, hey, let's both, we're the only two, companies in town that sell whatever product we're talking about, right? Let's raise our prices by 25%, right? If we do, we all make 25% more money, right? This sounds great, okay? What am I going to do if I can get Andy to agree to that?
Sucker punch him.
Yeah. So how am I going to start? I'm just going to walk up and like punch him. So no.
Maybe sell for 20% instead of 25.
Yeah, I might lower it to 20% higher instead of 25 because I know customers aren't stupid, right? They're going to go wherever the low price is. If it's the same good, and everything's exactly the same, right? And so Andy and I might agree like, hey, let's raise our prices 25%, but I'm going to cheat. I'm only going to raise it by 20. Ha ha ha, right? Because then I still get 20% more per unit, but all of Andy's customers are going to come to my store instead, right? And then Andy, you now know that I'm probably going to cheat you. So what are you going to do?
Lower it even more.
Yeah, Andy, you might say like, you know what? I've agreed to 25%, but I know Dave's a little shifty character and he's only going to raise his prices by 20%. So I'm only going to raise my prices by 15%, right? But now I know this too. So I know this about Andy. So what am I going to do? I'm going to be like, I'm going to sucker punch you again. I'm only going up by 10, right? And then Andy will only go up by 5. And then I say, screw it. I'm not going up at all. Watch this, right? So our collusive bargain breaks down really fast, right? And so that actually is one of so most economists actually don't want to see what we could call like antitrust policy, because for the most part, we're like, it's not going to happen because these greedy businesses are going to cheat. Like if they're willing to try to cheat their customers, they're probably willing to try to cheat their competitors too, right? And so like even if they met in those smoke-filled rooms, right, and tried to like do some backroom dealing, they're going to cheat each other and the collusion is going to break down anyway, unless there's some sort of an enforcement mechanism, right? And so the enforcement mechanism that Best Buy and a few other companies have come up with is the price match plus 10% guarantee. So here it says, hey, if Andy is cheating on our agreement to raise our prices, I'm going to punish him by taking all of his customers away, guaranteed. So basically, me being like Best Buy in this case, I have turned every single consumer into a spy on every single other company's pricing strategy. And if anyone breaks rank and cheats, I will know, and I can punish them by charging a ridiculously low price, 10% less than they do, and getting all the customers to come to me instead. And then I can go over to Andy and thump him on the head and say, knock it off, buddy. We're getting back into this agreement here, right? And then Andy will raise his prices back up and we'll be back in business printing money. What do you think about that? All right, so now how do you feel about Target doing it? You're like, you sons of bitches. Right, at least like maybe a little bit. Right, so it turns like that's just game theory too. It's just a more extended form of a sequential game and how we can block the outcome that we don't want, right? And so there's all kinds of like really cool applications of this stuff to the real world and how to use it. So when you get out in the real world and you're a manager somewhere and you're high up and you can set pricing strategies, what should you do? You should go collude with all your competitors because that's the Catholic way, right? Not really, I'm kidding. But now you can see this kind of stuff and you can see, how you could structure all these types of things. And how you can like make those diagonal moves. So issue like a joint, press statement. Say like, hey, let's go out in public together and announce what we're doing, right? And if you can frame it in a way that sounds positive, as in like, we're all going to do price match plus 10% guarantees, right? That sounds wonderful. Might not actually be wonderful though, right? And so that's the cool thing, the cool stuff from tonight. Does that all kind of make sense? You have any questions on like anything that we've covered tonight? Right, decision trees, backwards induction, right? That all makes sense, like how you do it. Okay, and then like dominant versus dominated strategies, all that good stuff. That all makes some sense, or at least it will once you like watch it back. All right, cool. Any thoughts, feelings, comments, concerns? No? All right, so tonight I'm gonna put a bunch of stuff up on Course Connect because we're way low on the number of hours or whatever that we're supposed to be hanging out because of online instead of like go talk amongst your friends, time. So I'm gonna put a bunch of stuff up on there for you to read that will be, relevant for this upcoming learning celebration that we've got in 2 weeks. All right, so remember this is only an 8-week course, right? We're on week 6, right? So the last week is final exam, which means next week is, I'm gonna stop recording, I guess, right?